Cancer is far more common than people realize. About 40% of us will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in our lifetime. And on one hand, a lot of the risk is just genetics and bad luck. But on the other hand, studies show that up to 40% of cancers in women and 57% of cancers in men may be preventable. Now, what does that mean? While you can't change your genetics, but you can influence how your genes behave. And one of the strongest levers you can pull to lower your risk of cancer is the foods that you eat or don't eat every day. Because cancer is not just a genetic disease, it's also a metabolic disease and an inflammatory disease. And in many ways, it's environmental. So the conditions inside your body matter. Your hormones and your level of inflammation and what kind of fuel your cells are exposed to. And this is the part that often gets missed. Even foods that seem normal or even healthy can push your body towards the exact conditions that cancer cells thrive in. So in this video, I want to walk you through specific foods that shape this internal environment. And I want to break down the science behind how they support or slow down cancer growth. I'll give you a simple framework to help you shift things in the right direction. One that makes it much more difficult for cancer cells to take hold and grow in the first place. And along the way, we'll take a closer look at red meat and how you should approach it, because it's one of the most debated foods in the space, and the data there is far more nuanced than headlines make it seem. And if you're new here, we share evidence-based health information on weight loss, metabolic health, and longevity. Let's get into it. So let's start with one of the most underestimated drivers of cancer risk, and that is sugar-sweetened beverages. And this one is tricky. Everyone knows about sodas, but then there's energy drinks, and there's juices, and sweetened coffee, and boba teas. These drinks deliver massive amounts of sugar into the bloodstream almost instantly. And we have large population studies that show that every additional 8-ounce drink of 100% fruit juice per day, so just one small glass, is associated with a 17% increase in breast cancer risk and a 10% increase in colorectal cancer risk, and a whopping 30% increased risk in the cancers of the biliary tract. So that refers to cancers of the gallbladder and the bile ducts, the small tubes that connect the liver to the intestines. And sugary drinks have also been linked to cancer of the liver and the pancreas, oral cavity, and prostate. Now, these studies show associations, so not proof of causation, but if you look at what's happening biologically, this lines up pretty well. And it starts with something called the Warburg effect. So most healthy cells generate energy very efficiently. They use oxygen to slowly extract large amounts of energy from nutrients. But cancer cells often behave very differently. Many of them switch to a faster metabolic pathway where they just burn through glucose extremely rapidly, even when there's oxygen available. And this process is called aerobic glycolysis. So think of it like an engine stuck at a full throttle. Cancer cells are constantly demanding fuel so they can divide and grow. And their preferred fuel is glucose. And there's another layer to this. When we consume large amounts of sugar, our body releases hormones like insulin and IGF-1. So these hormones regulate blood sugar, but they act as growth signals. They tell cells to grow and divide and store energy. And many cancer cells have far more insulin receptors than normal cells. In fact, some breast cancer cells actually have 6 to 10 times more insulin receptors than normal healthy cells, which means they respond much more strongly to insulin signaling. So when insulin levels remain chronically elevated, we would call this hyperinsulinemia. The body is essentially bathing cells in growth signals. And if abnormal cells are present, well, those signals can accelerate their growth. This is why liquid sugar is especially concerning. It delivers large glucose loads without fiber, without satiety, and without slowing down absorption. So it's one of the fastest ways to push the body into that cancer-promoting metabolic environment. And there's also another issue that we have to worry about when it comes to sweet beverages, especially fruit juices, and that is inorganic arsenic exposure. So arsenic is classified as a group 1 carcinogen. It can damage DNA, and it can disrupt gene regulation. And arsenic has been linked to lung cancer and bladder cancer and some skin cancers. And the American Cancer Society specifically lists fruit juice, and especially apple juice, among foods to avoid consuming excessively due to possible arsenic contamination. And other foods that we have to worry about when it comes to arsenic would be rice or rice products. So just from the arsenic contamination standpoint, white rice is usually lower in arsenic than brown rice. And there are simple ways to reduce exposure even further. One trick is to soak rice in water overnight and rinse it thoroughly before cooking. So if rice, especially white rice, is a regular part of your diet, those simple steps can meaningfully reduce that arsenic exposure. But sugary beverages are really just one part of a much larger pattern, and that pattern is the rise of ultra-processed foods. So these foods are heavily industrialized. They're made mostly from refined ingredients rather than whole foods. This would be things like packaged snacks, fast food, processed desserts, most breakfast cereals, and many frozen meals. These foods are engineered to be extremely palatable, which means they're designed to taste so good that it's hard to stop eating them. And they're also convenient and inexpensive. But they tend to drive the exact metabolic conditions that cancer cells thrive in. Large population studies show that every 10% increase in ultra-processed food intake, your overall cancer risk goes up by 13%. And just looking at colorectal cancer, which is the fastest growing cancer in young people today, their risk goes up by 30%. Now again, this is association, not proof of causation, but the biology behind it makes sense. Because here's the problem. First, ultra-processed foods tend to drive rapid blood sugar spikes, which reinforces that insulin signaling environment that we talked about earlier. And second, these foods promote chronic, low-grade inflammation. That can weaken your immune system, which is the first-line defense that we have against abnormal cancer cells. And third, these foods can disrupt the gut microbiome. Many ultra-processed foods contain additives like emulsifiers that improve texture and improve shelf life. But these compounds can damage the intestinal barrier and promote inflammation and worsen your gut health. And then we're running into the whole food displacement paradigm. The more ultra-processed foods that we eat, the less room there are for protective whole foods. So we end up getting less fiber and fewer phytochemicals and fewer vitamins and minerals, all of which are important for immune cells to function properly and to protect us against cancer. So the problem is not just one ingredient, it's the overall dietary environment. Now, another food category that we have to discuss is heavily salted or pickled foods. Certain preserved foods, especially those high in salt, have been linked to increased risk of stomach cancer. High salt concentrations can damage the lining of the stomach, and they can promote chronic inflammation. And over time, that repeated irritation makes the stomach more vulnerable to cancer-promoting compounds. And we have studies show that people with high salt intake have about a 68% higher risk of gastric cancer compared to people with lower intake. Then some of these preserved foods also contain compounds called nitrosamines, which are known to damage DNA. So this is one reason stomach cancer has historically been much more common in regions where salty or preserved foods are dietary staples, like in some parts of East Asia. Now, another category that is often left out of conversations about food and cancer is alcohol. And this is important because a lot of people still think of alcohol as separate from nutrition. But biologically, alcohol is something your body has to process, and that process can create compounds that directly affect cancer risk. When you drink alcohol, your body converts ethanol into acetaldehyde, and acetaldehyde is toxic. It can damage DNA and proteins, and if that damage is not repaired correctly, it can contribute to the early stages of cancer development. Alcohol can also increase oxidative stress, interfere with the absorption and metabolism of certain nutrients, and in women, it can raise estrogen levels, which is one reason alcohol is linked to breast cancer risk. And this is not just about liquor. Beer, wine, cocktails, and hard seltzers all contain ethanol. Red wine sometimes gets a health halo because it contains compounds like resveratrol. But you do not need alcohol to get protective plant compounds. You can get them from grapes, berries, peanuts, and other whole foods without exposing yourself to ethanol and acetaldehyde. Alcohol has been causally linked to cancers of the mouth, throat, voice box, esophagus, liver, colon and rectum, and female breast. And the pattern is dose-dependent, which means the more you drink over time, the higher the risk tends to become. Now, that does not mean one drink guarantees cancer. Risk does not work that way. It means that alcohol shifts probability in the wrong direction, and the effect accumulates over time. So from a cancer prevention standpoint, less is better, and not drinking is better than drinking. If you currently drink most nights, you do not have to think in all or nothing terms. Start by reducing the number of drinking days each week. Make the serving smaller. Alternate with sparkling water. Avoid using alcohol as the automatic way to end every stressful day. Those changes may sound simple, but cancer prevention is usually the result of small choices repeated for years, not one dramatic decision made for a week. And alcohol becomes even more concerning when it is combined with smoking, because alcohol can make tissues in the mouth and throat more vulnerable to other carcinogens. So if someone drinks and smokes, addressing both habits together can be far more important than worrying about one individual food. Now stop for a moment. So far, we have covered 4 parts of the dietary environment that can push cancer risk in the wrong direction: sugary drinks, ultra-processed foods, heavily salted or pickled foods, and alcohol. But the most controversial category is still ahead. In part 2, we are going to look at processed meat and red meat. And the evidence is not as simple as the headlines make it sound. In fact, one study found that adding one specific type of fiber brought a marker linked to DNA damage all the way back to baseline. So do not assume the answer is simply to stop eating meat. What you eat with it, how often you eat it, and how you cook it may completely change the picture. And after that, I will give you the simple 5-step framework that can help make your overall diet less favorable for chronic inflammation. And before you go, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of this message.